Captain Neil sat on the edge of his repair station, the dull hum of his ship's engines a constant backdrop. A tangle of wires dangled from his hand as he muttered to himself, just need to route this through. Your comms blinking, his co-pilot, Harrison, interrupted from the cockpit doorway. Harrison, a wiry man with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, leaned casually against the frame. What's the big emergency now? Neil frowned and waved him off. Probably another trader trying to unload junk. Give me a second. The blinking comm light was indeed a distress call, but not from a trader. The message was barely coherent, its signal crackling through static. Neil adjusted a few knobs, trying to make sense of the garbled words. Help, under attack, repeat, came a strained, unfamiliar voice. Do we answer? Harrison asked, already knowing Neil's answer. Of course, Neil said, a touch of exasperation in his tone. He tapped the comm panel. This is the ship Nova's Edge. Your signal's weak, state your location and nature of emergency. The reply came through in broken phrases. Shuttle, hit, drifting near grid point 7. Grid point 7? Harrison raised an eyebrow. That's nowhere. What's someone doing out there? Doesn't matter, Neil said, pulling up the ship's navigational chart. If they're out there and in trouble, we're going to find them. Harrison sighed but moved to the cockpit. Setting course. You know, one of these days, helping random people is gonna get us into more trouble than it's worth. Neil shot him a look. Better than leaving them to die. By the time the Nova's Edge reached the coordinates, Neil was already suited up, ready to board the drifting shuttle. Through the viewport, they saw it, a small vessel badly scarred by weapons fire. It was tumbling slowly, like a ship that had lost all control systems. I've got you locked in, Harrison said from the controls. Just don't bring back a nest of pirates. Neil smirked as he sealed his helmet. Noted. He crossed the airlock, magnetized boots clinking against the floor. The inside of the shuttle was dim and eerily silent. Sparks flickered from exposed panels and the air carried a faint acrid tang of burnt electronics. Neil's eyes swept the cramped interior until they landed on a figure slumped against the bulkhead. Hey, he called, voice steady but loud enough to carry through his suit's comm, I'm here to help. Are you injured? The figure stirred, slowly lifting their head. Neil paused. The alien woman's skin was a deep blue-gray, her features sharp and angular, a pair of small, swept-back horns crowning her head. She was clad in armor, though it was battered and scorched, and her left arm hung limply at her side. Who? She began, voice raspy. You're human. That's right, Neil replied. And you need a medic. My ship's got better equipment than this wreck. Can you stand? The alien stared at him for a moment, then shook her head. No, my leg. Neil crouched down, taking in the damage. Her leg was pinned under a collapsed console, and the armor there was badly warped. He glanced back at the open airlock and called over the comm, Harrison, I need the med kit and the pry bar. Looks like she's stuck. Great. Guess I'm doing everything today, Harrison muttered. A minute later, he appeared in the shuttle's hatch, lugging the requested gear. There's your med kit. You owe me a drink. Neil ignored him and focused on freeing the alien's leg. He worked carefully, using the pry bar to shift the console without jarring her further. She winced but didn't cry out. What's your name? Neil asked, trying to keep her distracted. Velka, she said after a long pause. Okay, Velka, Neil said. We're going to get you out of here. Just hang tight. He motioned to Harrison. Hold that steady while I slide her leg free. Harrison grumbled under his breath but obeyed. Together, they managed to extricate Velka from the wreckage. Neil quickly examined her leg, noting the cracked armor and swollen tissue underneath. Your leg's a mess, he said. But I can treat it once we're back on my ship. Can you put any weight on it at all? Velka shook her head. Neil sighed and nodded to Harrison. Help me carry her. Sure, why not? It's not like I have anything better to do, Harrison quipped, though he moved to support Velka's uninjured side. They moved slowly, careful not to jostle her more than necessary. Back aboard the Nova's Edge, Neil guided her to the med bay. Harrison handed over the med kit and leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Now what? He asked. Now I patch her up, Neil replied, already laying out tools and scanning her injuries. This isn't the worst I've seen, but it's going to take some time. Velka watched him silently, her sharp eyes tracking his every movement. Neil glanced at her. I've seen that look before. You don't trust me. Velka didn't answer, but her expression said enough. Look, Neil said, meeting her gaze, I'm not expecting you to trust me right off the bat. But I'm not here to hurt you. Just let me do my job and get you back on your feet. Harrison chuckled softly. That's the closest thing to a motivational speech I've ever heard from you. Neil shot him a glare. If you're not going to help, go check the flight systems. I'm going, Harrison said, throwing up his hands as he left the med bay. Once alone, Neil worked quickly. He repaired the minor wounds, splinted Velka's leg, and started cleaning up her damaged armor. He talked as he worked, hoping to draw her out. "So, Velka," he said, "what's a Kareth warrior doing out near Grid Point 7? That's not exactly a tourist spot." Her lips tightened, and for a moment Neil thought she wouldn't answer. Then she said, "I was hunting. Looking for someone who wronged my family." "And you ran into trouble?" Velka nodded faintly. "An ambush. I managed to fight them off, but my shuttle was hit. Systems failed." She hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "I didn't think I'd survive." "Well, lucky for you, I don't believe in leaving anyone behind," Neil said, offering a small, reassuring smile. "I'll fix your armor, get you patched up, and then you can decide what you want to do." Velka looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally she said, "Thank you, human." "I owe you." Neil waved her off. "You don't owe me anything. Just focus on healing." As he worked, Velka's shoulders relaxed slightly, her eyes softening as she watched him. Neil didn't press her for more details, but he could feel the tension in the room begin to ease. The silence was no longer heavy with suspicion, but instead filled with a tentative sense of understanding. Neil knew it was a small step, but sometimes small steps led to larger changes. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 2, Layers Beneath the Armor. Neil leaned over the workbench in the ship's cramped maintenance bay, his hands deftly picking apart the charred remains of Velka's armor plating. The circuits and conduits woven into the material were unlike anything he'd seen before, a mix of organic and synthetic design that hummed faintly under his fingertips. "Pass me that scanner," he said, glancing at Harrison, who sat cross-legged on the floor, tinkering with an old servo module. "Sure," Harrison said, tossing the tool across the room. Neil caught it with one hand and flipped it on, the scanner's soft green light tracing the damaged components. "You keep poking at it like that and the whole thing's gonna short out again," Harrison commented. "Didn't you already spend hours rewiring that panel?" "This isn't just about rewiring," Neil muttered. "Look at the way these fibers react. They're not just conducting electricity, they're carrying data, maybe even adapting to external inputs." "Yeah, great," Harrison replied dryly, setting down his servo. "But how about you let me know when it actually works?" Neil ignored him, too focused on the armor's intricate design. Velka had been keeping to herself since he'd started the repairs, but he could feel her presence nearby. She hovered silently in the doorway, watching as Neil examined the plating. "You know," Neil said without looking up, "you can come in if you want. I'm not gonna bite." Velka stepped into the room, her movements deliberate and wary. "What are you doing to it?" "Trying to figure out how it's supposed to function," Neil replied. "This is different from human tech. You've got self-healing materials, energy-conserving circuits, hell, even the way it's bonded together is more advanced than anything I've handled." Velka crossed her arms, her sharp gaze fixed on the armor pieces spread across the bench. "Then why haven't you finished?" "Because," Neil said with a grin, "I don't want to ruin something that's clearly built to last." Harrison snorted. "That's just Neil's excuse for taking forever. The guy overthinks everything." Velka looked between them, her expression unreadable. "You're an unusual crew." "We prefer the term resourceful," Neil said. He set down the scanner and turned to her. "Seriously, though, this is fascinating work. I can tell that whoever built this didn't just throw it together. There's intent here, design. You don't see that in most human-made armor." She seemed to consider his words for a moment, then said, "The Kareth craftspeople take great pride in their work. Every piece is designed to serve its owner in battle, to protect and adapt. And now I get the honor of patching it up," Neil said. "Tell me, what's this layer supposed to do?" He gestured to a thin, flexible panel etched with intricate patterns. Velka hesitated. Then, as though deciding he'd already seen enough to justify an explanation, she said, "It's a dampening lattice. It disperses energy from plasma strikes and redirects it to the armor's reserve cells. It's not meant to block the impact entirely, but to reduce the damage and provide backup energy in critical situations." Neil nodded slowly, processing her explanation. "So if I reconnect these conduits here and here, it should restore that functionality, right?" Velka stepped closer, leaning over the workbench. "No. You'd overload the primary relay. The conduits need to be rerouted through the secondary matrix." "Got it," Neil said, carefully adjusting the placement. He handed Velka a tool. "You mind holding that in place?" Velka took the tool, her movements precise. She pressed the connector as Neil worked on the circuitry, their hands almost brushing. Harrison, still sprawled on the floor, rolled his eyes. "Look at the two of you, bonding over circuits. I feel left out." "Maybe if you didn't spend all day fiddling with old servos," Neil shot back. "I'm upgrading the servos," Harrison corrected, waving a wrench. "Big difference." Velka smirked, a rare expression that caught Neil off guard. He didn't comment, but something about that small shift in her demeanor felt like progress. As the hours passed, Velka grew more involved in the repairs. She explained the intricate layering of the armor's defense systems, pointing out the subtle engineering that allowed the suit to adapt in battle. Neil listened intently, asking questions and occasionally making a light-hearted comment to keep the atmosphere relaxed. "So this thing's practically a second skin," Neil said, soldering a connection. "Ever feel weird putting it on, like it's alive?" Velka tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "No. To us, it's simply a tool. But I suppose I never thought about it in that way. Humans tend to personify their tech," Neil said with a grin. "Makes us feel more connected to it." "You think I should name my armor, then?" Velka asked, her tone half serious. "Why not?" Neil replied. "Give it a good name. Something tough. Like Gladiator." Velka raised an eyebrow. "Gladiator? That sounds like a human child's idea of a warrior's name." Neil laughed. "Fair enough. What would you call it then?" She looked down at the partially repaired armor, her expression thoughtful. "It doesn't need a name. It just needs to work." "Spoken like a true pragmatist," Neil said. He set down his tools, stretching his arms. "I think we're making good progress. Another hour or two and we'll have this section done." "You're better at this than I expected," Velka admitted. Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of warmth in the words. "Compliments from a Kareth warrior?" Neil said, raising an eyebrow. "I'll take it." Harrison snorted again from his corner. "You're impossible, Neil." The three of them continued working, the atmosphere becoming less tense and more collaborative. Velka still didn't share much about herself, but her occasional dry humor and quiet observations hinted at a more complex personality beneath the reserved exterior. As Neil carefully reattached a panel, he said, "You know, Velka, once this armor's back to full strength, you'll be good as new. What's your next move after that?" Velka's expression darkened slightly, but she didn't shy away from the question. "I have a mission to complete. A personal matter." "Sounds serious," Neil said. "You sure you don't want backup?" Velka shook her head. "No. This is something I must handle alone." "Well, if you ever change your mind, we're not going anywhere," Neil said. "We're just a calm call away." Velka glanced at him, her sharp gaze softening for just a moment. "I'll remember that." Harrison stood and stretched. "You two keep it. I'm grabbing a drink. Don't start any philosophical debates while I'm gone." Neil chuckled. "No promises." As Harrison left, Velka placed the tool down and looked directly at Neil. "You're different from other humans I've met." "How so?" Neil asked, genuinely curious. "You don't ask for anything in return," Velka said. "Most would demand payment, favors, something. But you just help." "Not everyone's looking to take advantage," Neil replied, his tone light. "Sometimes it's just about doing the right thing." Velka's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she nodded, a hint of something unspoken in her expression. Neil returned to the armor repairs, but he couldn't help feeling that their partnership, however temporary, was beginning to shift into something more. Chapter 3: A Test of Trust. The ship's comm system crackled to life, cutting through the steady hum of the Nova's Edge engines. Harrison's voice came through, sounding tense. "Neil, we've got incoming." Neil looked up from the toolkit spread across the workbench. "What kind of incoming?" "Inspection crew." "They're hailing us," Harrison replied. "Looks like a patrol ship from the Concord authorities." Neil frowned and glanced at Velka, who was sitting nearby. Her armor repairs had gone well, but she was far from ready to be dealing with Concord officials. They'd consider her a fugitive the second they laid eyes on her. He leaned toward the intercom. "How much time before they dock?" 10 minutes, maybe less," Harrison said. "What's the plan, boss?" "Stall them if you can," Neil said. He turned to Velka, whose sharp eyes were fixed on him. "You can't stay here while they're on board. They'll take one look at you and start asking questions I can't answer." Velka crossed her arms. "I'm not hiding like a scared child." "Yeah, well, I'm not asking," Neil shot back. "We're in Concord territory and they don't exactly welcome your kind. If we don't play the smart, they'll haul you off before I can finish putting your armor back together." Velka's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Neil turned back to the intercom. "Harrison, keep them occupied for a few minutes. Tell them we've got a critical system recalibration underway or something." "You want me to lie to a Concord inspection crew?" Harrison asked, a note of incredulity in his voice. "Yes, and do it well," Neil said. "Velka, follow me." He led her out of the workshop and down the corridor to the cargo bay. The space was cluttered with crates of spare parts, tools, and a few unmarked containers from previous salvage runs. Neil gestured toward a maintenance hatch set into the floor. "Get in here." Velka narrowed her eyes. "This is your brilliant plan?" "Temporary plan," Neil corrected. "It's shielded from scans and they'll never think to check it. Just stay quiet and out of sight." She hesitated for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. Fine. But if they find me? They won't, Neil interrupted. Just trust me on this one. Velka climbed into the narrow space, shifting uncomfortably as Neil secured the hatch. He patted the cover. Hang tight. I'll get rid of them as fast as I can. By the time Neil made it to the cockpit, Harrison had already connected the comm link. The image of a Concord officer in a crisp uniform filled the screen. The officer's expression was as stern as they came. This is Concord Patrol Alpha 17. We're conducting a routine inspection of vessels in this sector. Prepare to be boarded. Understood, Alpha 17, Neil said, keeping his voice steady. We're just finishing a system recalibration. It might take a few minutes before we can power down completely. The officer frowned. System recalibration? Yeah, Neil said with a nod. Our navigational array was acting up, so we had to reinitialize the core alignment. I'd hate to shut everything down mid-process and risk a full system crash. Give us 5 minutes and we'll be ready for inspection. The officer's eyes narrowed. You have 3. Neil nodded again. 3 minutes. Got it. The comm went dark and Neil let out a low breath. He turned to Harrison, who was leaning back in his seat. How's that for buying time? Harrison shrugged. Could have been worse. But what's the plan now? They'll board, poke around, and if they see anything out of the ordinary. They won't, Neil said firmly. Velka's tucked away, her armor's stashed, and we're clean on every other front. Sure, but you know these guys love to dig, Harrison muttered. If they get suspicious. They won't, Neil repeated. Just keep cool. When the Concord officers boarded, Neil greeted them with a polite smile. Welcome aboard. Sorry for the delay. Those recalibrations can be a pain. The lead officer gave a curt nod. We'll keep this brief. Step aside while we perform our inspection. Neil and Harrison stood back as the officers moved through the ship. Neil kept a careful eye on them, noting every crate they opened, every panel they scanned. His heart thudded in his chest when they approached the cargo bay. One of the officers pointed to a stack of containers. What's in there? Spare parts, Neil said casually. Salvaged from a derelict freighter last week. I can show you the inventory logs if you'd like. The officer gave him a sharp look, then moved on without another word. Neil exchanged a quick glance with Harrison, who gave a small shrug as if to say, so far, so good. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lead officer returned. Everything seems in order. We'll be on our way. Much appreciated, Neil said, maintaining his polite tone. Safe travels. As the officers filed out and the docking clamps released, Neil waited until their patrol ship was a safe distance away before hurrying back to the cargo bay. He popped open the maintenance hatch, helping Velka climb out. They're gone, he said. You can breathe now. Velka stepped out, dusting herself off. That was reckless. If they had found me. But they didn't, Neil interrupted. And now we can get back to finishing your armor without a Concord Patrol Brea. HDLY softened expression. Why go to such lengths for me? You could have handed me over and avoided all of this. Neil shrugged. Because it was the right thing to do. And because I believe you're worth it. Velka didn't reply, but something in her gaze shifted. There was a glimmer of understanding or maybe appreciation. Neil couldn't be sure. All he knew was that for the first time since she'd come aboard, she seemed to let her guard down, if only slightly. Chapter 4, A Gesture Beyond Words. The Nova's Edge was quiet as Neil stood in the ship's workshop, finishing the last repairs on Velka's armor. He was surrounded by tools and fragments of Kareth plating, the components spread out in precise rows. Neil didn't like leaving a job half-done, and after everything Velka had endured, he felt more determined than ever to get it right. Harrison wandered in, munching on a protein bar. You've been at that thing for hours. You sure it's not going to turn into a toaster once she puts it back on? Neil didn't look up. The only way it'll become a toaster is if you touch it. So don't. Harrison chuckled, leaning against the doorframe. Seriously, though, it's looking good. You've never worked on alien gear before, right? First time, Neil admitted. But it's all about understanding the basics. Once I figured out how the energy circuits run through these panels, the rest fell into place. Harrison smirked. Just don't blow it up when you run the diagnostics. Neil finally glanced over at him. I've got it under control. Now go do something useful like running a systems check. Harrison held up his hands in mock surrender. All right, Captain. I'll leave you to your masterpiece. He sauntered off, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Neil returned his focus to the armor. The repairs were nearly complete, but there was one final touch he wanted to add. He reached for his laser engraver and carefully etched a small, intricate symbol onto the inner surface of one of the plates. It wasn't much, just a tiny detail he'd picked up from the conversations he and Velka had shared. Something he hoped would mean something to her, even if she never mentioned it. As Neil finished the engraving, Velka appeared in the doorway. She was wearing a plain jumpsuit, her posture as upright and composed as ever. She stepped into the workshop, her gaze shifting to the armor laid out on the workbench. "You've made a lot of progress," she said. "Just putting the finishing touches on," Neil replied, setting the engraver aside. "It's ready for a final test." Velka approached, running her hand over the smooth, repaired surface of the chest plate. "It looks almost new." Neil grinned. "Better than new, I'd say. Go ahead, try it on." Velka glanced at him, her sharp gaze assessing. After a moment, she began to assemble the armor, piece by piece. Neil stepped back, watching as the intricate panels locked into place with a soft hum. Velka moved with practiced precision, her movements fluid despite the unfamiliar repairs. When the last piece clicked into place, she flexed her arms and turned to Neil. "No energy surges. No malfunctions. It feels balanced." "Good," Neil said, relieved. "Run through the diagnostics. I want to make sure everything's functioning properly before you head out." Velka nodded and began the process. As the suit's systems cycled through their tests, the faint glow of the Kareth energy circuits lit up along the seams of the armor. Neil watched intently, his hands on his hips, waiting for any sign of error. But the readings remained steady. "You did it," Velka said quietly, her tone not exactly surprised, but certainly approving. Neil smiled. "Told you I'd get it done." Velka stepped closer, her sharp features softened slightly by the glow of the suit's energy lines. "You've done more than repair this armor. You've shown me a level of trust one didn't expect." "It's what I do," Neil said lightly, though her words struck a chord. "I saw a challenge and figured it out. Simple as that." Velka tilted her head slightly. "And the engraving? That wasn't necessary." Neil's grin faltered for a moment. "Just thought it might mean something to you. Consider it a mark of respect." Velka regarded him quietly, her gaze lingering on his face. "Respect from a human. I didn't think I'd ever hear that." "Well, you've earned it," Neil said simply. "You're not just another job. He hesitated, searching for the right words. "You're someone worth helping." Velka's expression softened further, and for the first time, she allowed herself a small smile. "You've done more than I expected, Neil. Thank you." Neil shrugged. "Like I said, just doing what I do. Now let's make sure you're ready for whatever's next." Velka nodded, but before she could turn away, Neil stepped forward. "One last thing," he said. "There's no rush to leave. If you need more time, we've got space here. No pressure." She studied him for a moment as though trying to decipher his motives. Finally, she said, "I'll think about it." Neil nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "Take your time. You've got options now." Chapter 5, Parting Without Goodbye. Neil leaned against the workshop's doorway, watching Velka move with familiar precision as she ran her final system checks. Her armor hummed softly, a subtle glow tracing the edges of each repaired plate. She turned her wrist, activating a small console embedded in her gauntlet. Numbers and symbols scrolled across the display, confirming the suit's readiness. Harrison's voice drifted down the corridor. "Neil, you coming or what?" Neil looked over his shoulder. "In a minute." He stepped into the workshop, closer to Velka. "How's it feeling?" She glanced at him, her sharp features calm and focused. "Stable. The energy grid is holding at optimal levels." "Good," Neil said, nodding toward the bench where his tools still lay. "I made some minor adjustments after the last test. Should give you a bit more flexibility in the lower joints." Velka tilted her head slightly. "You've put a lot of effort into this." "I told you I would," Neil replied simply. "When I take on a job, I finish it." For a moment, they stood in silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the armor and the occasional click of Velka's console. Neil reached out and tapped one of the armored shoulder plates. "This here should help deflect anything short of a direct plasma burst." "Not that you plan on getting hit, right?" Velka allowed a faint smirk. "Not if I can help it." "Good," Neil said, returning her small smile. "Would hate to see all my hard work go to waste." Harrison appeared in the doorway, arms crossed and eyebrows raised. "You two done admiring the shiny armor? I've got a sensor array to calibrate." Neil rolled his eyes. "We'll be out in a second." Harrison held up his hands in mock surrender. "Sure thing, Captain. Just don't take all day." He disappeared back into the corridor. Velka powered down the console on her gauntlet, her expression turning more serious. "You've done more for me than I expected. I won't forget that." I don't do it for the recognition, Neil said, shrugging. I do it because it's right. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Still, I owe you a debt. And I don't take such things lightly. Neil waved it off. No debts. Consider it a gesture of goodwill. Velka's sharp gaze softened slightly. Humans are strange. Glad to hear it, Neil replied, grinning. It's part of our charm. She didn't laugh, but the corners of her mouth lifted ever so slightly. Neil had learned not to expect too much, but he couldn't help feeling that small gesture meant more than words. As Velka prepared her gear for departure, Neil leaned against the bench, arms crossed. So what's next for you? Heading back to your people. Her expression hardened slightly. I have unfinished business. A matter of honor that I must resolve. Sounds heavy, Neil said, his tone lighter to offset her intensity. But you're not going alone, right? Velka didn't answer immediately. Finally, she said, it's something I must handle myself. Well, you know where to find me if you need backup, Neil offered. This ship's not going anywhere. Velka turned toward him, her expression unreadable. Why would you offer to help me again? You have no reason to. Maybe I just like fixing things, Neil said with a small shrug. And sometimes fixing things means sticking around a bit longer. Her gaze lingered on him as though she was trying to understand his motives. In the end, she only nodded. Thank you. Harrison reappeared, leaning in the doorway again. So, you leaving now, or should I start cooking dinner for 3? Velka looked at Neil. I'll leave soon. Suit yourself, Harrison said, waving a hand. Just don't get too cozy. We've got jobs to run. Neil shot him a look. Thanks for the input, Harrison. Harrison grinned and disappeared once more, leaving Neil and Velka alone again. Neil rubbed the back of his neck. So, I guess this is goodbye. Velka nodded. It is. Neil hesitated, then reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, just above the newly engraved symbol. Good luck, Velka. And remember, this armor can take a hit, but don't push it too far. She looked down at his hand for a moment, then back up at him. I'll be careful. Neil smiled, then stepped back. Take care of yourself. Velka turned and walked toward the airlock. Neil watched her go, the sound of her armor's servos faintly audible as she moved. When she reached the hatch, she paused, glancing back over her shoulder. Neil, she said, her voice steady. Yeah? He replied. She hesitated, as if weighing her words. Finally, she said, You are different. Neil raised an eyebrow. Different good or different bad? Velka didn't answer. Instead, she offered the faintest hint of a smile, then turned and stepped into the airlock. A moment later, the hatch sealed, and the Nova's edge was left in silence. Neil let out a breath and leaned against the wall. Different, he murmured to himself, shaking his head with a small grin. I'll take it. Harrison poked his head around the corner. What was that all about? Nothing, Neil said, pushing off the wall. Just saying goodbye. Well, don't get too sentimental on me, Harrison teased. We've got work to do. Neil smiled. Yeah, let's get to it. As he headed back toward the cockpit, he couldn't help but glance at the now empty workshop. The repaired armor was gone, but the effort he'd put into it, and the trust he'd earned, felt like more than just a job completed. Felt like a step toward something bigger. But for now, he had a ship to run, and that was enough.